everybody for coming and figuring out. We only knew kind of pretty late in the day that we could do this live. And so it does matter to have an audience. And so thank you for being here. LaRon Williams, who's joining us, is probably all of you know, but I'll tell you anyway, is an award-winning storyteller who's been practicing his craft for more than 30 years and is known nationwide. He's a member of the National Storytelling Network, the National Association of Black Storytellers, and the Detroit Association of Black Storytellers. But we are proud to claim him as native of Southeast Michigan. And you know, he's known in particular for stories that promote diversity and that foster community, and that would be perfect for our church on any day. But I know from my first conversation with him that he is deeply aware of the urgency of all of us becoming better stewards of this planet Earth. And so we're especially delighted to have him as part of our series on living with hope in the age of climate change and on Mother's Day. And so with that, LaRon, Stories for Mother Earth.
Thank you so much. So yeah, welcome everybody on this special day. I was thinking before I came down here, sat down here, that, you know, there really is no day that's more appropriate to discuss the issue of environment than Mother's Day. A few years ago, maybe about 4 years ago, I did a TED Talk at the Ypsilanti Library, the EMU Library, excuse me. And the TED Talk was about changing stories in order to change deep paradigms by which we live. And as part of that presentation, I had a PowerPoint display and talked about a time when in the early 1970s, I think it was Apollo 17, I'm not sure if I'm getting the number right, but one of the Apollo astronauts on the way to the moon just decided on a lark to turn around and take a photograph of the Earth from the capsule. And that picture, that photograph became famous because it was the first time that a photo of that kind had been taken from space and showed so clearly so much of the surface of the Earth. You could very distinctly see the African continent and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. It was a practically cloudless day. And the very next day after the photo was sent to the Earth, the headlines in newspapers and magazines all over the country reflected this, what they called new awareness. Some of them said, this changes everything. And it came to be called the blue marble. That photograph came to be called the blue marble. And I noted in my TED Talk that yes, it changed our perceptions of things for a while, but we seem to have gone right back to the way that we thought before that. I mean, it was astonishing the way that people were acknowledging that this was our only home, right, in space, and that we really had no place else to go that was like that place. And the way that we acknowledged that Earth was our mother, the mother of all of us. And so to me, this is a very appropriate day to talk about climate, what's going on with the Earth, how we treat things. Paradigms, changing basic paradigms. So here we are nearly 50 years after that photograph, and we desire change in the way that we relate to the environment, but we haven't done enough to change basic paradigms by which we live. And therefore, things have gotten even worse than they were back when that photograph was taken. We've endured a hole in the ozone layer. There's a mountain of waste in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, excuse me. No, Pacific Ocean. So many things have gotten so much worse. So the question came up in my mind, why is it that even though we claim we want to see difference and change, why is it that things have remained so much the same? There's a word that I'm trying to get people to use, trying to coin this phrase, get credit for it. I call the word is dysteranist, Dysterranist. And I'm prompting people, pushing people to try to use that word, because it underscores a kind of philosophy that we have about things, right? The underlying values that are encased in, enclosed in thousands and thousands and thousands of stories that we tell and that we share. So if we hope to make any changes, we have to do something about getting at those underlying values. So let me see if I can give you a story that it helps to explain some of those values, and then we'll point out what those underlying values were. Many of you may have heard this story before. It's called The Three Billy Goats Gruff. Once upon a time, when I was 7 years old, I got sick and I had to stay home from school. Now, I thought that being home from school would be a lot of fun. I thought that because I didn't feel that bad, I would just go out and play. I might call up my best friend on the telephone. We'd meet each other. We'd go play together and we'd have a good time. But then all of a sudden, I realized that my best friend was at school. I mean, I realized that everybody I knew was at school. And my mother was home, but, she worked, at that time, she worked second shift in a factory. And when she came home, she would do all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the housework, everything that needed to be done, because my father worked first shift in the factory. But when he came home, he would just sit down in the nice soft chair and take out the newspaper and sit there and fall asleep. So my mother was too tired to play. And there was nothing on TV in those days except soap operas. But then I got a good idea. I decided to climb in bed with all my toys, pull the covers up really close around me, and tell myself stories like the stories that my second grade teacher, Ms. Davis, used to tell us. And one of those stories was the story of the Three Billy Goats Gruff. Once upon a time, there were these three brothers, and their name was Gruff. Now, these three brothers lived on one side of a very, very, very deep valley. And on their side of the valley, there used to be a lot of nice, fresh green grass for them to eat, but slowly they ate up all that grass. Now, they could see that on the other side of the valley, there was still a lot of nice, fresh green grass for them to eat, but the only way they could get across to that other side would be to walk over a bridge. And underneath that bridge, there lived a mean, ugly, nasty, disgusting, cruel, wicked, vile, vicious, fiendish, obnoxious, horrible, deadly, dangerous, despicable, never brushed his teeth troll. Now, the troll was mean. Every single thing that tried to cross that bridge, the troll would eat them up. Didn't care who they were, didn't care where they came from. Well, now, the three brothers knew that the troll was there, but one day they got so hungry that the littlest Billy Goat decided to cross the bridge. He climbed up on the bridge, trip, trop, trip, trop, trip, trop, trip, trop. Boom. All of a sudden, up came the troll. The troll looked at the tiny little Billy Goat and said, trip, trop on my bridge. Who's that walking on my bridge? Why, it's you, little Billy Goat. Don't you know I'm going to eat you up? Little Billy Goat looked at the troll and said, wait a minute, wait a minute. I'm much too small to make a decent meal for you. Why don't you wait till my bigger brother comes along? He's much bigger and much tastier too. The troll thought, bigger, tastier, okay. Chip, chop, chip, chop, chip, chop, chip. Little goat went on across. Pretty soon the second Gruff brother came along. And the troll jumped up on the bridge and saw the second Gruff brother, said, trip, trop on my bridge. Who's that walking on my bridge? Why, it's you, second Billy Goat. Don't you know I'm going to eat you up? Wait a minute, wait a minute. Second Billy Goat said, I'm much too small to make a decent meal for you. Why don't you wait till my bigger brother comes along? Troll thought, bigger? Might be tastier too. Okay, so he let the second Gruff brother go on across, and then after a while, the third Gruff brother came along. He was huge. Boom, 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 boom. He came walking across the bridge. The troll jumped up. He said, trip, trop on my bridge. Who's that walking on my bridge? Why, it's you, third Billy Goat. But before the troll could even get his statement out, bam! The big goat butted the troll off the bridge down into the valley below. And who knows what happened to it after that? Drip, drop, drip, drop, drip, drop. The big goat went on across. All three Gruff brothers enjoyed a delicious, delicious grass meal. Now, like I said a minute ago, we learn to be dysteranist. So the question is, where do we get those ideas? And what are the ideas that we might use to replace them? Well, first of all, let's look at some of the things that are in that story. There's the notion that you can trust your family, but you may not be able to trust those who are unlike you, right? I mean, it's not a strong message, but it is contained within the overall message of the story. We're taught to think like that because we are surrounded by millions and millions and millions of stories that teach those lessons. Also, we're taught through that story that if you eat up all the grass on your side of the bridge, just go on over to the other side, right? I mean, there's an endless supply, and so you can always move on. There are millions of stories that teach us those lessons. We have to become conscious of the messages underlying our stories before we can replace them with other messages. I grew up learning to be wasteful. I grew up learning to want a lot of things. I grew up learning to think selfishly. I was surrounded by stories that taught me those messages, and all of those things contributed to my, I won't call it willingness because it was unconscious, but my habit of destroying the environment, my habit. I have a story for you. This is a true story. One day, late in November, when I was 10 years old, I looked up from my customary breakfast, which was a bowl of Kellogg's Sugar Pops with 2 extra teaspoons of sugar. And I told my mother what I wanted for Christmas. I looked her straight in the eye and I said, I want a rocket launcher. It was the early 1960s. And a whole lot of people were talking about things that hinted at this being the beginning of the space age. You know, Alan Shepard had gone up in space, John Glenn, regular trips to the moon. We were talking about vacations on Mars. The Jetsons had just come on TV. I know you all, a lot of you are old enough to remember that stuff. I knew exactly what I wanted because I had seen it advertised on TV. And I had that image stored away in my mind. So it came, what I wanted came mounted on a flatbed railroad car. It was compact, but it was also powerful enough that if I used it, it would command respect from all of my friends who might come over to visit. So I told my mother about it. And I told her about it because I have to confess, I was 10 sophisticated years old. And by that time in my life, I no longer believed in Santa Claus. Yeah, I know. It's a stage kids go through. So at breakfast on that Saturday morning in November, after all my brothers and my sister had gone off to do some serious day off from school play and cartoon watching, I looked at my mother and I said to her directly, Mama, I want a rocket launcher for Christmas. She didn't even ask any questions. She had 5 kids, and she had already seen me and my older brother go through toy soldiers, toy guns, toy hand grenades. We had mentally killed each other over 1,000 times, and we had mentally exploded everything in the house. By the time I was 10 years old, she was probably so shell-shocked. She suffered PTSD, which I call parental traumatic shock disorder. She just glanced back at me, and without hesitation, she said, okay. Now, when kids are young enough, they always think that the brand name toys that excite them will also be exciting to the adults around them. Of course, this is also a stage that kids only go through. It changes as they get older and they come to realize that mama and daddy are just great big dorks who don't have a clue when it comes to popular culture. But at age 10, it never occurred to me that my mother might not have any idea what a rocket launcher even was, let alone that she would share the image I had in my mind of this sort of portable weapon of mass destruction. So when I told her what I wanted, I just assumed the name alone was enough for her to get the best thing on the market. And she may not have had a clue, but bless her heart, she went out and she tried. She searched, even though she had no idea what to look for. And as Christmas approached, on Saturday afternoons, I would see her leave the house and go out shopping with my Aunt Freddie, all dressed up in their late 1950s hats and their white gloves, trooping down to Kresge's to scour the shelves for anything that resembled their ideas of space missiles. And I could always tell when she hadn't been successful because it showed on her face whenever she returned home. But the weeks went by, and then one day, very close to the big day, I noticed that the look of concern that she had gone away. I felt confident that this was going to be a pretty good year. And on Christmas morning, I was cool, I ambled downstairs to open my presents, because by that time, my younger brothers and sister had already been awake for hours, because Christmas still drove them crazy. I was once like that too, but like I said, I was 10 sophisticated years old, so I sat patiently through their first wave of manic package opening. And by the time my older brother and I got to our stuff, the little kids had settled into relatively quiet play. I don't remember what else I got that year. I just know that one box was particularly huge and maybe 2 or 3 times bigger than I'd even dreamed it might be. And when I tore off the wrapping paper around it, I saw what it was, and I could hardly believe my eyes. I mean, I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled. I mean, there, right in my lap, was the painted image of 2 powerful-looking Titan-style rockets. They were blasting right up in perfect imitation 3D, right up off that box. And there were yellow and red flames that shot out of the back ends of their sleek metallic bodies. Their bright red nose cones pierced the air as they virtually leaped into my face while I sat there. I mean, this was even more than I had hoped for, and I was just beaming. I had wanted one small train-mounted device, but this picture made it clear I was holding a package with very powerful contents that could barely be restrained. A box containing 2 massive fire-spewing missiles, and they came complete. It said there right on the box, complete with compression-powered launching pads. Oh man, this clearly was enough to make me warlord of the neighborhood. So for a few seconds, I didn't even open the box. I didn't want to touch anything. I didn't want it to explode in my lap. I even thought of taking it outside in case I couldn't keep the power under control, but I was too eager to wait that long, so I took the top off carefully. Now let me pause here to say that life isn't always gentle in the way it offers its most important lesson. Not a single one of us escapes without being wounded, at least a little bit. If we're lucky, we learn and we move on stronger because we've survived. Unfortunately, this was not going to be one of those times. For a few seconds, as I held that huge, beautifully illustrated package, everything was fabulous. I mean, in a kind of unformulated way, as I sat with the unopened box on my lap, I was joyfully aware that my mother's happiness was a reflection of my happiness. In the same moment that I sat staring at the painting of the twin missiles springing up into my face, I was also seeing with my peripheral vision what she was doing. When I smiled, she smiled. Now, if I'd been older and wiser, I might have thought beyond myself to see how important that moment was for her too. I mean, after all, she had succeeded in doing something that parents all over the country dream of. She had bought a Christmas gift that made her child happy. But like I said, 10 is a funny age. And while I was old enough to be semi-conscious of what my mother was experiencing, her vicarious pleasure, I wasn't old enough to rise above my own feelings when what I thought was real magic started to reveal itself to be a simple parlor trick. My face and my mother's face both sank when I took the top off that box and looked at what was inside. The first disappointment came when I saw that all the parts of that rocket, all those parts that were described on the box top were just sitting there couched in little slots in a sea of cardboard that made the whole thing look bigger than it actually was. Most of that big box was nothing but paper. There was no fire, there were no Titan missiles, there were only two little bitty hollow plastic tubes with small wing-like projections coming off of the bottom. And they had red painted paper nose cones at the tip. The compression-powered launching pads were these two diaphragm-like domes of plastic mounted on top of a plastic box with a plastic tube that came out of it and that fit into the base of the cardboard rocket. And if you hit the boom, the little plastic compression thing hard enough, air would squirt through that thing and it would cause that little rocket to pop off. And if you hit it exactly right and held it straight up in the air, it might go maybe 2 feet up before it fell back down. Now, this was not what I had in mind. These were not weapons of mass destruction. These things couldn't be mounted on railroad cars. They weren't even self-propelled. If I'd been more mature, I might have pretended, at least for the moment, that I appreciated the effort my mother had put in to get any kind of gift at all. I mean, she always worked very, very hard. But like I said, I was 10, and at age 10, it's a tough job for us to step outside of ourselves enough to be able to consider the feelings of others above our own. As I slumped, so did my mother. Now, looking back on it now, I can see that it was a lesson in competing values, like I've been talking about. The commercial values of the marketplace versus the values of the heart. My poor mother thought she had stumbled upon a great gift. She probably was tired from buying presents, from staying up half the night wrapping those presents, from preparing food for everybody to eat. She probably was exhausted. And if I had thought about it, if I'd been more conscious, I might have paid more attention to her. The only thing is that a mother's love doesn't seem to matter when those people who paint the covers of those boxes, sitting somewhere in their corporate boardrooms. They don't even think about that. They think about the illusion that they're going to create that will cause you to buy their product. They think only about how they make their money, and they never consider how many hearts will be broken if the things they sell promise much more joy and substance than they actually deliver. But I was lucky. I really was. As a child, I had countless opportunities to come to know and accept the ways that my mother cared for me. And the same was true in reverse. That rocket launcher Christmas was only one of many, and most of the others were happy enough that they become like a wall of comfort in the foundation of my psyche. But the lesson of that one year has stayed with me. Real joy rests in the people who care about us. Real joy rests in human relationships. Real joy only comes when we're willing to open the metaphorical boxes of our hearts and allow others to sample what's inside. I call that the rocket launcher Christmas. And like I said, it is a true story. Values, values, values. How do we choose? How do we decide? Well, there's a story that goes along with that too. It's an old, at least I'm told, it's an old Native American story about a grandfather and his grandson, and the grandfather was talking with the son about the difference between good and evil. He said, good and evil are two competing values that exist inside our hearts. The good is the positive qualities that we share with others. The good is our joy, it's our happiness, it's our feeling of comfort in the world. And the evil is our feeling of discomfort and our jealousy and our rage and our anger and the way that we don't get along with others. They're constantly fighting, constantly at odds with each other inside of our hearts. And the little boy looked at his grandfather and he said, well, grandfather, which of those two forces will win the fight? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. I remember the day that I broke my addiction to stuff. This is also a true event. When I was in high school, I wanted to get things. I wanted to have the best sunglasses, and in those days there were these little granny glasses that people were walking around wearing. I wanted a pair of granny glasses. I wanted a big floppy hat to wear because I admired this band called the Chambers Brothers, and they wore big floppy hats when they performed. I wanted to have really big wide bell bottoms because that's what people were wearing at the end of my high school years. And even when I went on to college, I wanted to have cool stuff. And there was a new shopping center that opened called Briarwood. And in Briarwood, one of the stores was a place called the Chess King. And at the Chess King, they had the best of those cool hippie-like clothing items. So I'd go to the Chess King and I would wish that I had the money to buy some of those things. But I just couldn't seem to save up enough money. I had to pay rent and I had to pay for food because I was on my own for the first time in my life. And one day, I was sitting at home wishing that I had those glasses so badly. And somebody came to our house to visit, and they were wearing the best pair of granny glasses that I'd seen. And I just walked up to them and said, you know, I really, 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 really wish that I had a pair of those glasses. And that person said, well, why don't you try these on? So I put them on my face, and when I got them on my face, they weren't anything at all. I mean, they weren't glasses because even if they had a prescription, they were so tiny that they weren't useful for anything. And they weren't sunglasses because, again, they were so small, they didn't block the sun to keep it out of your eyes. And so I handed the glasses back to that person, and I just started thinking, I don't know why it was so different that year, but I started thinking, why do I want this stuff so much? And in that instant, and I mean it was instantaneous, I no longer had the desire to have half of the things that I wanted to have before. All of a sudden, I broke my addiction. After I became a storyteller and started to examine the values and the lessons in stories, as I said earlier, I came to see that there were certain values that were repeated over and over and over and over again in the stories that I had heard and the stories that I saw being shared. Now, I don't have time to go through all of those values, but here are three primary values that the old lessons teach us. They teach us, first of all, to think hierarchically, to think that we can rank not just people and animals, but all of nature, and that there are some things that matter and some things that don't. They teach us that there are good guys and there are bad guys, and that they exist in fundamentally, diametrically opposed and adversarial relationships with each other. The good guys deserve the best things that happen, and they deserve to win, and the bad guys deserve, well, anything that happens to them. I mean, really, anything that happens, because after all, they are bad guys. They teach us that violence works, that it's a viable means to solve problems. And they teach us that the world and the resources in it are infinite. So if you happen to eat up all the grass on your side of the bridge, then all you got to do is walk across to the other side. It's perfectly fine. And if there's anybody else living there already, just kill them. You know, it's okay, because violence works and they're probably bad. So we learn those messages, we soak those things up through the thousands of stories that we hear. But luckily, there are stories that give us a different set of values to live by. So I've got a story that I want to share with you, one that I heard in the early days when I first started telling stories. This is a Nigerian folktale, and it's really a warning about being wasteful. A long, long time ago, the world was very different from the way that it is today. Back then, water was so new that it was just learning how to run. Birds couldn't fly yet, and they had to walk everywhere they went. There were no trees or mountains, and the sky was very, very close to the ground. It was so close that if you were tall enough, like Shaquille O'Neal, you could just reach up and touch it with your bare hand. And the rest of the people could climb up on rocks and things. They could reach up and they could actually touch the sky. But that's not all. The sky also was edible in those days. Yeah. I mean, you know, if you were hungry enough, you could just break off a piece and put it in your mouth and eat it. And how do you think it tasted? It was delicious. I mean, the blue part of the sky tasted like luscious blueberries. And the clouds tasted like sweet cotton candy. And at the end of the day, when the sun set and there were reds and yellows and all the different colors, it tasted like strawberries and bananas and delicious milkshake, all rolled all up into one. I mean, the people could eat the sky. And it tasted so good that they ate it all the time. That meant that hardly anybody ever worked to grow any food at all. I mean, the people could eat the sky. That's pretty nice. Well, it was nice for a long time. But slowly, people started eating more of the sky than they actually needed. Sometimes they would break up and break off a huge piece of the sky and eat just a little bit of it and lick around some of the edge, and then just throw the rest on the ground. For a long time, people did that. Just a little, throw away the rest. Until finally, the sky got so tired of this happening that the sky actually talked. The sky called out. The sky said, "Now listen, you people. I've had enough of this. I'm tired of you all just breaking off a piece of me and then licking a little bit of it and dropping the rest down on the ground. If you all don't behave yourselves and eat as much as you need and no more, then I'm going to move so far away that nobody will ever be able to reach me again." Do you all understand that? Well, the people got the message. And for a long time, the people would only eat as much of the sky as they actually needed for a long time. And they passed on the story to their children and so on. But eventually, you know how it goes, eventually the children stopped hearing the message. Until one day, many years after the day of the sky's warning, one little girl and one little boy walking down the road climbed up on a small hill. They reached up and they broke off the biggest piece of sky that you'd ever want to see in your lives. I mean, boom. This piece of sky was so big that on one edge it was late summer and on the other edge it was the middle of the winter. This piece of sky was so big that it had all kinds of thunderstorms running around in it, lightning coming down. It was huge. And the little girl and the little boy just broke off a tiny little bit of it and they ate it and they looked at all the rest of this and boom, threw it down in a big heap. Well, the sky didn't say anything at all. It just started to lift itself up higher and higher. Now, when the people saw that the sky was leaving, they panicked. Oh, they didn't know what to do. I mean, the sky is leaving us. So they gathered around and they started to plead with the sky, "Please come back, come back." But the sky didn't say a thing. It just continued to move farther and farther and farther away until it got to be as far away as it is now. The next day, when the people woke up to what they had done, they realized they no longer had the sky to eat. They realized they had to work to grow food. But they created this story to give that message to us, not to be so wasteful. And they passed it on, just like they passed on our labor. And that's why it is that to this day, people have to work to grow food. And that's why it is that to this day, the sky is so far away that nobody can reach it. And that's the end of that story. Oh, I have a friend who is a very, very good storyteller and also a very good author. And his name is Bill Lepp. That's spelled Billepp. And he wrote a story that when I first heard it, I just loved it. And it's a story about the world and things that we have around us. What is it now? 18 minutes after the hour. So I'm gonna tie things up with this story by storyteller Bill Lepp. It's called The King of Little Things. A long, long time ago, on the side of a big, big mountain, there lived a tiny, tiny king. He was the king of little things. While all the other kings worried about the big things of the world, the king of little things ruled over everything small. He was the king of combs and keys, ants and fleas. He was the king of knots and buttons and beetles and peas. He ruled over paper clips, lentils, marbles, and even tiny, tiny pieces of cheese. The king of little things had a small, small house and a little bitty queen. He fed the birds. He left crumbs for the mice. He planted tiny flowers in thimbles for the bees. He had everything he needed and didn't want anything more. But that wasn't true of the bigger kings. No matter how large their kingdoms were, they always wanted more. Bigger riches, bigger britches, bigger moats, deeper ditches. The greediest of all the kings was King Edward the Enormous. He wanted to be king of the whole world. So one day he gathered together an army. I mean, a very big army. He raided realms. He squashed sovereignties. He eradicated empires. And when he was sure he had conquered every other king, queen, chief, sultan, Raja, Rani, and empress in the world, he decided it was time to have a great big party. He ordered his large cooks to fix a fabulous feast. He commanded his huge goldsmith to create a colossal crown. He instructed his immense tailors to sew a splendid suit. At last, he proclaimed, at last, I am the king of everything. But one of his sizable stewards raised a trembling hand. I beg your pardon, your highness of great heft. What is it? Sniffed the king. My large liege, I believe you've missed the minuscule majesty, the king of little things. What? King of little things? You mean little things have a king? That's nonsense. Everybody knows that little things only exist to serve big things. King Enormous stroked his large and lengthy beard. So tell me, where does this little king live? Through your oldest forest on the other side of one of your mountains, my considerable sire, said his steward. Gather my armies, King Enormous said. We'll go there immediately and put this tiny little king in his very small place. Well, they marched for days and days and days, but then finally King Enormous and his extensive armies reached the home of the king of little things. This was not going to be a fair fight, but that's just the way the big king liked it. Well, as the army approached, the king of little things sent a message to his subjects. He had a plan and he needed their help. During the night, he sent out the message and all the little things went to work. So the next morning, the massive soldiers found mealworms in their cereal. They found ticks in their underwear. There was fungus between their toes. Worse yet, they had nothing with which to fight. I mean, termites had made dust of their arrow shafts. Water droplets had ruined their gunpowder. Rust had crumbled their cannons and their swords. In a fit of rage, King Enormous called for his council. If we can't defeat this king through might, then we'll have to use another of our biggest weapons. We must lie. Invite this king to my tent under a flag of truce. Tell him we want to be good friends, but prepare the dungeon. Well, as soon as the king of little things entered the big king's palace, all the nearby small things recognized that their king was there in front of them. Nails came out of the doors. Coins rolled out of the big king's coffers. Jewels jumped from his crown. Buttons popped out of his suspenders. The king of little things just stood there, while the big king, in nothing but his underwear, didn't know what to say. The soldiers tried to, they tried to do what the king told them to do, but when they peeled out their keys, the keys would not do anything. They wouldn't turn in any of the locks. Nothing worked. When the word got out that their king, the little king, that they were trying to imprison the little king, the little things everywhere made themselves known. I mean, strings unstrung, hangers unhung, frills unfrilled, pickles undilled. Quills quivered, pencil points shivered, cookies crumbled, blocks tumbled, ticks and tocks left their clocks, and every little thing everywhere refused to work. Pretty soon, all the big king's subjects began to storm King Enormous's castle, and they began to demand that he release this prisoner. And the king, without any armies to fight, he had no choice. So the king of little things walked back home, and all the little things went back to work. And King Edward the Enormous, well, he spent the rest of his days searching for his keys, looking for his spectacles, trying to find his pocket watch, not being able to dig up his socks or his wallet or his belt buckle. And he never, ever, ever thought about little things in the same way again. It's a lesson for all of us, the king of little things. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laurent. Thank you. And we all want to thank you. You're all unmuted, so you can applaud.
Yeah. Very nice. Excellent.
And we have, what have we got here? About 4 minutes. If you all want to ask questions about anything, or I love to do questions as much as I love to close doors. I can see.
Somebody started. Go ahead if you have a question.
Okay, not much of a question, but I really enjoyed your stories. I was a storyteller for the public library. My first job was at Kresge's, so I really connected with your stories. And Billy Goat's Gruff was one of my favorite stories that I used to tell my audiences. So it was nice to hear a different version of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam.
Yeah, I really love the way that you get with your idea of the dis-Terranist ways of thinking. Just going, I said that right, didn't I?
Yes, you did. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. Really just going deep into what is underneath the stories that can seem so innocent on the surface. And I think you're right that most of the stories we tell have one or more of these dis-Terranist ways of thinking. So that was really valuable. And then to hear it come through the stories. I love the Nigerian story. And I just want to tell you that so did my cat, who came to sit on my lap during that one. And each time you hit the drum, he was like, what is going on that screen? It was awesome.
I was very touched by your story about the King of Little Things. And I think that it's deeply relevant to the current times.
Yeah. Well, remember, that's Bill Lepp's story. I definitely want to make sure he gets credit. He wrote it.
One of the things it made me think of is this horrifying thing that we face now of the insect apocalypse. What they're calling the insect apocalypse, and how everything falls apart when the insects go, no matter how small. Yeah. But that king sounds like a really nice king, the King of Little Things. And I don't think the King of Little Things set the coronavirus after us.
No, but it reminds me of, I don't know what, who may have seen Spike Lee's Ode to New York, But the King of Little Things story reminds me very much of that very short video that he's made. And you know, beginning with our initial vision of what New York is about, from the song New York, New York, and ending with the clapping for the essential workers in New York. It's a very, very touching story, and I think is very much about your story about the King of Little Things.
Anybody else with a question or an appreciation?
One of the things that I frequently think about or remind myself of is that, you know, this is a worldwide phenomenon. You know, the coronavirus has made a lot of people think more deeply about our relationship with the rest of the earth than we might ordinarily do. And it has brought into the spotlight how much we have in common with the poorest among us. That was a part of the idea behind the story of the King of Little Things, that, you know, we depend so much on the livelihood, the quality of life of those people that do essential work, not just here, but also around the world. And yet, so infrequently do we hear anything about their lives, what their lives are like, the conditions under which they live, you know. The danger with this coronavirus, let me start by saying that one of the things this coronavirus has revealed is that unless you take care of the least among us in this country, the least among us, then the threat is there for everybody. And if you amplify that to the rest of the planet, that also holds true. The threat remains for everybody on Earth if anybody is in danger of spreading this thing. And so part of the idea behind the King of Little Things story was just to remind us, you have to pay attention to what we might consider little things in life, in the world, as much as we do with the big things that we hear about every day. And again, it comes down to the values that we promote. You know, we have a choice. Like those two wolves that are inside of us, we have a choice between which set of values we're going to follow.
And as you said, which one we feed.
Which one we feed.
Which one we see?
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Laron. And let me let everyone know that Laron is doing programs this weekend, Friday, Saturday, this coming weekend, Friday, Saturday, is Sunday, as part of a memorial for the founder of the Farmington African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's the birthday of the church and a memorial for the founder. And Laron will be telling stories in particular around the theme of beloved community. So there are many chances, I'm sure, to see things Laron has done in the past on the web, but this is one to see, this is a chance to see what he's doing right now in Farmington. So, and I absolutely promise again that when we are allowed to, we will have you back to First Presbyterian in person and poll all the people who are technophobes that we weren't able to get this morning.